Valeska Suratt, the forgotten heroine of the 20th century. Written by Efren Mendieta. Narrated by Skye. The subsequent story is a presumed representation of the life and career of former actress Valeska Suratt, based on a culmination of research, covering the known events of her life spanning from Suratt's birth up until her death. Special thanks to Bill Piper and his website, valeskasuratt.com, and to Dot Lewis for creating the Valeska Suratt Facebook group. I don't mean I can cook because I can't very much, but if I married a poor man, I could learn, and I would cook something besides bacon and eggs, too. I have my French cook, whom I have had for 11 years. That's what I have her for, to do the cooking. But I love my home and everything about it. Mother and I had our home together as long as she lived. I am alone now, but I could not live without a place to really relax and rest in. My home is the biggest comfort in life to me. Valeska Suratt. On June 28, 1882, the town of Owensville, Indiana, welcomed a future star, Valeska Suratt, born to Ralph and Anna Suratt. Her time in Owensville would be short-lived, seeing as her family relocated to Terre Haute, Indiana in 1888 while she was only 6 years old. It was here where Valeska would grow up alongside her 4 siblings, Austin, Leah, Ralph, aka Judge, Richard, and her stepsister Myrtle Strickland. Growing up, Suratt soon discovered a love for singing, regularly taking part in the choir at a local Central Presbyterian church, and by the age of 12, she had already decided that her dream was to one day be a famous actress. According to Leah, in a 1961 interview, Valeska was making wishes upon the stars every night. At only 16, Valeska would quit school and go on to work at Claire's sister's photography studio, retouching photographs. Growing envious of the studio's clients and their beautiful dresses, Valeska saved up money for a year before relocating to Indianapolis, where she would become an assistant at a millinery department. It was here where she became a seamstress apprentice and learned how to properly design, making impressive yet affordable knockoffs of the latest fashion she adored from New York and Paris. I got $3 a week as a milliner's model. In addition, I got 10 cents for every hat I sold. I remember how hard I used to work for those extra dimes, how I tilted hats gracefully on my head to convince prospective customers they were charming. Valeska Suratt. Chapter 1. Early Life, 1882 to 1900. On June 28, 1882, the town of Owensville, Indiana, welcomed a future star, Valeska Suratt, born to Ralph and Anna Suratt. Her time in Owensville would be short-lived, seeing as her family relocated to Terre Haute, Indiana in 1888 while she was only 6 years old. It was here where Valeska would grow up alongside her 4 siblings, Austin, Leah, Ralph, aka Judge, Richard, and her stepsister Myrtle Strickland. Growing up, Suratt soon discovered a love for singing, regularly taking part in the choir at a local Central Presbyterian church, and by the age of 12, she had already decided that her dream was to one day be a famous actress. According to Leah, in a 1961 interview, Valeska was making wishes upon the stars every night. At only 16, Valeska would quit school and go on to work at Claire's sister's photography studio, retouching photographs. Growing envious of the studio's clients and their beautiful dresses, Valeska saved up money for a year before relocating to Indianapolis, where she would become an assistant at a millinery department. It was here where she became a seamstress apprentice and learned how to properly design, making impressive yet affordable knockoffs of the latest fashion she adored from New York and Paris. I got $3 a week as a milliner's model. In addition, I got 10 cents for every hat I sold. I remember how hard I used to work for those extra dimes, how I tilted hats gracefully on my head to convince prospective customers they were charming. Valeska Suratt. Chapter 2. Early Career, 1900 to 1907. Valeska's career wouldn't formally begin until the turn of the century, as in 1900. While Valeska was in Indianapolis, her sister Leah ended up winning $1,000 from a 25-cent lottery ticket. An astonished Valeska would hurry back home upon reading about it in the paper, borrow her sister's money, and naively travel to New York in an attempt to jumpstart her career, where her efforts on Broadway as a chorus girl were only met with failure. After this spectacular letdown, Valeska returned to Terre Haute, where her skills helped her get hired as a wholesale buyer and eventual clerk for William H. Block's department store, earning $3 a week. Growing irritated with her position, she begged to be transferred to the millinery department during the Christmas season, enticed with the benefit of getting a percentage of whatever she was to sell. The week before Christmas proved to be very successful for Valeska, believing herself to be a rich woman from the $18 she made. Not deterred from her earlier failure in New York, she saved up money to once again pursue a career on stage. Valeska's second opportunity came in 1904, albeit this time it being a more gradual transition. Having saved up enough money by 1904, she, along with her mother, moved to Chicago in order for Valeska to train in dance, vocals, and music. She would take with her a poster of one of her biggest idols, actress Anna Held, who was known for her provocative nature and songs, an image that Valeska herself would attempt to emulate. It was here in Chicago where she would meet her first husband, Billy Gould, a vaudevillian performer. After discovering the talents she had polished, the two would go on a tour via vaudeville in 1905, which included traveling to South Africa and London until the fall of 1906, when she decided to move back to New York. Do you know, I don't believe I was ever stage-struck. The theater never really got me and held me as it does so many. I had a natural stage presence. I stayed with it for years, but it never penetrated very far into my private life. Valeska Suratt. Chapter 3. The Belle of Mayfair. Valeska was generally perceived as a noticeably tall woman for that era, standing at 5 feet 8 inches. She was noted as having brown hair and grayish-blue eyes, coincidentally being mistaken early on as a Gibson girl, a role that she would go on to play on stage, finally giving Valeska her big break. With the show The Belle of Mayfair already playing in London, producer Edward Edelston had spent the summer of 1906 searching all over New York to cast his perfect Gibson girl for a special number. It's alleged that Edelston set his sights across the pond, continuing his search in London where he discovered Valeska at the Savoy Hotel. That night, Valeska lit up the hotel with one of her custom-designed dresses, donning a backless, tight-fitting black velvet princess sheath gown, which was said to be inspired by fashion's most eye-catching features of that year. As Valeska made a slow and unavoidable descent down the stairway, she was able to capture the attention of her friends in the lobby and the plethora of theatrical producers, one of these producers being Edward Edelston, who simply labeled her as a beauty and went on to finally declare, There is my Gibson girl, but she is not an actress. That's some society dame. Well, she is going to be an actress if I have to drag her by the hair on her head back to New York on the next boat. It shouldn't come as a surprise that Valeska eagerly accepted the offer, seeing as Edelston was keen on proving that he had found the perfect Gibson girl. As he soon discovered, the culmination of dance and singing talent she had crafted over the years, composer Leslie Stewart was asked to incorporate song and dance routines into her character, the Duchess of Dunmow. Valeska enthralled the audience, receiving 6 encores for her rendition of Why Do They Call Me a Gibson Girl, making her an overnight theatrical sensation. The Belle of Mayfair took place from December 3, 1906 until March 30, 1907, at the now-demolished Daly's Theater in New York, with the show comprising a total of 140 performances. According to a 1906 review in the play Pictorial, the first act of the play follows a young couple named Julia Chaldecott and Raymond Mount Highgate, who fall madly in love during a sham auction taking place at a bazaar held in a London private park. This raised an alarm for Julia's father, Sir John Chaldecott, Baronet, who hated Raymond's family, Among the distinguished visitors present at the auction were the Duchess of Dunmow and Princess Karl of Ehrenbreitstein, a charming English girl married to a German prince. Raymond's friends advised him not to worry about marriage and to enjoy himself instead, while Julia's high-powered friends, including Princess Karl, tried to get him sent overseas as a diplomat. Julia's father tried to end the match by announcing that his daughter was going to become engaged to the Comte de Perrier, a conductor of a foreign band that was touring in the vicinity, and he was paid to become Julia's official suitor. As a result, Raymond threatened to punch Comte and elope with Julia. The second act follows Sir John and his lady, who were now at the opera, as Julia was being presented at court by the princess. A member of the orchestra brought a bag containing the band leader's costume to Sir John's house. Shortly afterwards, Sir John and Lady Chaldecott returned. Some guests have been invited to meet Julia after her presentation. Soon, Julia entered, radiant and beautiful in her court dress. And before long, Raymond arrived to plan the elopement. Raymond intended to ask Dr. Marmaduke Lawrence, the Bishop of Brighton, to officiate at the wedding. They were interrupted in their scheming, and Raymond, on Julia's inspiration, dons the costume of the missing bandmaster and confers with her father as to the program of music. Sir John grew disturbed by the bandmaster's apparent change of manner. Just when everything was arranged, Princess Karl appealed to Julia not to run away with Raymond, as the shock might injure her father's health, and Julia, like a dutiful daughter, consented to wait. Sir John demanded that his daughter give up Raymond entirely and unconditionally. Julia made a tender and impassioned appeal that her heart may not be broken, and in the end Sir John gave way. Lord Mount Highgate and his wife, who arrived to assist in frustrating the elopement, heard Julia declare her love for Raymond. Her father gave his consent to the marriage. A general reconciliation took place and everything ended happily. It was during this show where Valeska would first reveal the erratic side of her character, concerning a backstage fashion rivalry. Infuriated after witnessing chorus girl Jeanette Horton allegedly copied her yellow gown, Valeska wasted no time in confronting Norton after a performance and ripped the dress off her. She then proceeded to claw at the woman. A journalist for the Times-Dispatch would write, "No one equals her, no one rivals her." The two women eventually settled the physical dispute, quietly and away from open court, but this did not stop the New York Telegraph from reporting that a number of young women on Broadway had begun to purposely copy small details from Valeska's dresses. Many of these women were aware that such a scandal that a slap could ensue would be crucial toward elevating their careers from overlooked chorus girls. We are wrought up to a high pitch of excitement by our work. I suppose it is our artistic temperaments that cause us to become so excitable. The stage manager was really to blame, but I gave Miss Horton a piece of my mind. Then she talked about me and boasted to the other girls that she had as pretty a figure as mine and that she could do my part just as well as I can. I don't say anything about my figure or my looks, but, well, can you blame me for being angry? And to cap the climax, she wore a dress like mine. When she came on the stage, I was amazed at her effrontery. I could hardly keep from killing her. Imagine my feelings playing a character part and having someone dressed just like me. I could hardly wait until the scene was over. Valeska Suratt. In reply, Miss Horton gave her side of it. I had no intention of imitating Miss Sewer Rat. That is what we call her. For I don't think I have any reason to imitate her. My dress was ripped off. She nearly strangled me, and I am going to have her arrested. Jeanette Horton. Further drama would arise following the actual onstage performances by Valeska. She was seen as one of the most captivating aspects of the play, inadvertently causing Edna May, a singer who had been dazzling audiences in London with her performances in The Belle of New York, to nearly quit the cast. The New York Times would go on to write, "As a matter of fact, Why Do They Call Me a Gibson Girl is the sort of song to make any actress jealous of another's opportunity to sing it." And with its novel specialty of living Gibson pictures, it created another sensation at Daly's last night. Chapter 4. Stage Career, 1907 to 1912. After the Belle of Mayfair closed, Valeska made her return to vaudeville, singing and performing dance routines with comic Billy Gibson. She eventually became the most popular attraction on the B.F. Keith circuit by 1910, with Oscar Hammerstein paying her $2,500 a week. With Billy Gibson, they most notably performed the infamous yet charismatic Apache dance. The dance originated on the streets of Belleville and Menilmontant in Paris, where the two participants would take part in a form of theatrical stage combat, with the dancers reenacting the behaviors of pimps and prostitutes, including mock strikes, throwing the woman to the ground, or having the woman struggle as she's lifted and carried away. She found her perfect dance partner in Gibson, and for years she continued to tour the theaters that the Keith circuit had to offer, performing songs, dances, and showcasing her lavish dresses, one of which was an $11,000 Cinderella cloak. It was during these years on the stage where she soon became dubbed the Empress of Fashions, as Valeska gained somewhat of a worldwide reputation for the luxurious clothes she would show off on stage during her productions. Along with frequent reports on her dresses, Vogue magazine went on to claim Valeska as one of the best-dressed women on the stage. By 1907, she eventually found herself performing solo with Gould, now out of the picture. Valeska's well-known talent was enough to see her partake in Broadway shows, while still finding opportunities to headline in vaudeville. It was in vaudeville where her public notoriety only grew due to the revealing and suggestive nature of her clothes, which required multiple changes during a single performance, as well as her singing and dancing, with Valeska going as far as to create melodramatic skits. It was with the skit format of vaudeville where Valeska thrived, seizing control over the production, including stage design, costumes, and writers. As her fame in vaudeville only grew, she began to declare herself as vaudeville's greatest star and the biggest drawing card in New York. I told Mr. Lasky that before he and the other photo play producers got through, they would find that they would be depending on vaudeville for their best talent. Vaudeville was crammed with individual genius. Every person on the big time is a highly trained specialist. Unfortunately, it is of course apparent that the same cannot be said of the dramatic stage from which the producers drew the names of people they used to attract the public. Vaudeville is sure to dominate the studios eventually. Valeska Suratt. That same year, Valeska would interrupt her tour to perform in the Broadway musical comedy Hip Hip Hooray. The play revolved around two German professors by the names of Julius Greenbacher, played by Joe Weber, and Dick Bernard, played by Michael Schultz. The two of them made an attempt to introduce a new breakfast cereal, Excited Oats, at Doolittle College, and became involved in love affairs with a widow named Mrs. Vera Shapley, played by Valeska, and Tootsie Tripper, played by Bessie Clayton. The production was said to have a relatively short run. According to Illustrated Saturday magazine, Miss Clayton's sprightly, high-kicking dancing allowed her to display her still famous, still beautiful legs, while the stylish Miss Suratt paraded about modeling exceptionally large hats dwarfed only by her elaborate, larger coiffes. Valeska's reputation only grew with the 1910 play The Girl with the Whooping Cough. The play was based on the misbehavior of a woman named Regina, played by Valeska, who passes whooping cough to the numerous men she kisses. The final act sees her love affairs eventually land her in divorce court, where she performs a dance routine borrowed from one of Valeska's vaudeville acts. The play was eventually brought to Broadway and opened at the New York Theater on April 25, 1910. Despite early viewing of rehearsal by the Trenton police deeming it fit for performance due to mild censorship, New York Governor William J. Gaynor was not pleased upon hearing rumors of the play's contents, even reviewing the script beforehand, although he at first could not find anything alarming. He grew suspicious on whether he had been given the accurate script he would send stenographers to take notes in person. Their reports back claimed that the actors had incorporated salacious elements into the performance. All of this soon prompted William Gaynor to have the New York Police Commissioner, William F. Baker, essentially shut down the play, further threatening to refuse the theater's operating license if they disregarded his requests of stopping the play. All of this news did nothing for Valeska except increase her reputation as a daring woman who pushed sexual boundaries in a play that promised to air her corsetless New York debut. In spite of the show's overwhelming negative reception, one critic in the New York Sun did praise Valeska's valiant efforts, saying, "Dramatic art had a boost last night through the modest effort to entertain offered by Valeska Suratt in corsetless gowns. Miss Suratt had long promised the waiting world that on this occasion she would positively appear without corsets. Whether she did or not does not matter much. The effect on dramatic art was the same. Without Miss Suratt, the piece would have been unutterably dull and stupid." Going into December of 1910, Valeska began a new partnership with fellow actor Fletcher Norton. She began to be known for performing in playlets for her comedic and melodramatic roles, as well as her appearances in many 30-minute mini-revues, a theatrical multi-act show that combines music, dance, and sketches. All of this was leading up to her mini-revue titled Bouffe Variety, a playlet at the Hammerstein's Victoria Theatre, which had Norton as her leading man. The show consisted of a romantic interlude, comedy routine, her song When Broadway Was a Pasture, and ultimately finished with her as the bride of the show. Although Valeska at this point had garnered herself a worthy reputation, Variety assured that the show wasn't good enough for the standards of the newly self-proclaimed Belle of Broadway. It didn't take long for Valeska to once again cause a stir due to her erotic attitude, as her role in the 1911 Broadway play The Red Rose became infamous after Valeska's promotional posters included a painting of the left side of her chest relatively unclothed, with just a rose placed over her nipple. According to the Green Book magazine, the play opens in the Parisian atelier of M. Julien Dupré, played by Henry Bergman. Lola, played by Valeska, the most beautiful of the models, was Dick Lorimer's favorite, played by Wallace McCutcheon, a young American artist and son of Alonzo Lorimer, played by Alexander Clark, a multi-millionaire corporation president. Dick had painted a picture of Lola, which he called the Red Rose. Having seen the painting on exhibition and marveling at the beauty of the original, Baron LeBlanc, played by Louis Cassavant, tried to find Lola in an effort to get her to pose as his daughter, in order that he may recoup his fortune by having the girl take over on his behalf the large amount of money that has been left for his long-lost child by his recently deceased wife. Lola, in fact, was this long-lost daughter, although neither she nor LeBlanc were aware of her true identity. There are others who knew who Lola was, but they hesitated to tell her for fear that she will desert their life and them once she comes into possession of the fortune that is awaiting her. In the meantime, Dick and Lola, as well as their respective fathers, have had considerable trouble at the hands of Raphael Spiegel, played by John Hazard, a blackmail expert, and the Honorable Lionel Talboys, played by Ernest Lambert, a fortune hunter. But in the last few minutes, Dick gets Lola, the Baron gets his long-lost daughter, and the long-lost daughter gets the fortune. The following year in 1912, Valeska lent her talents to the production The Kiss Waltz. Celebrated musical numbers included Ta Ta Little Boy, Love is Like a Little Rubber Band, Pan Me with a Movement Slow, and Elevation. Valeska Suratt is heralded as the present-day queen of beauty. She is probably the most discussed stage person of the moment. The Kiss Waltz is the best vehicle she has yet had to display her talents and her beauty. Pacific Coast Musical Review. One of Valeska's most memorable performances of the Kiss Waltz took place on March 12, 1912, at the now-demolished Prince Theater in Houston. In her first visit to the South, despite being the star leading lady, she found herself heckled by a portion of the audience during the first act. The decent audience downstairs, shocked by the vulgar comments, joined Valeska in falsely believing this behavior would soon come to an end. Just as she was beginning the pièce de résistance of the opera, one more suggestive remark was all it took for her to signal the orchestra to stop playing before confronting the hecklers on the edge of the stage. Once the production resumed, the first bars of music were completely overshadowed by the audience's applause. One more word like that from the gallery and the show stops. This is my first trip to the South, and this is the first time I have encountered anything of this kind. In fact, I have toured the entire world, all over Europe and the East, and I have never been subjected to the same treatment. Mind you, I love the gallery. but just one more word from up there and I will stop the play. Valeska Suratt. Chapter 5. Film Career, 1915 to 1917. As Valeska's career was progressing and heading into the world of cinema, she always made sure to maintain a relationship with her beloved town of Terre Haute. She is said to have spent many vacations back home with her family, purchasing a home in the town and going as far as to open her own hat shop in 1914. Valeska was also remembered as quite a giving person, being praised for her charities and good deeds to relatives, even being noted as donating $500 of her weekly salary to the war effort and Red Cross during World War I. During these visits, she would not stray away from the life that made her blessed and would go out of her way to perform at several local theaters in Terre Haute. By 1914, Valeska had already become a formidable figure in the world of vaudeville and Broadway. Despite her history of acting on the stage, she had yet to star in any silent films, which were hitting a high point during the 1910s. Although she only had to wait until the following year to make her big screen debut, Valeska found herself considered and ultimately passed for the iconic role of the vampire in 1915's A Fool There Was. The story was based on a woman known as the vampire ruining the life of a young diplomat, led to the iconic vamp image that propelled Theda Bara, in her debut role, into one of the most iconic actresses of all time, essentially relegating most other vamp characters to lesser films, including Valeska. Despite missing out on the role in A Fool There Was, Valeska too made her film debut on October 18, 1915, starring in The Soul of Broadway, written by Les Adams and directed by Herbert Brennan. The story is based on Valeska's character Grace Leonard, aka La Valencia, a dancer who catches the attention of a sophisticated president of a local bank. Bennett, played by William E. Shea, soon falls in love with the woman. Meanwhile, a man named Lawton, played by George W. Middleton, shamelessly attempts to gain her affection by showering her with money. While she disliked the man, her love for money was enough for her to tolerate him. In a desperate effort to win over Grace, Bennett decided to steal the funds from his workplace. Before reaching her apartment, he became angry when he discovered that she was taking money from Lawton. Upon arrival, he soon finds a $1,200 check Lawton had left for Grace, tears it to shreds, and begins to confront the woman. Seeing Bennett raise his hand in an attempt to strike her, Grace grabs a pearl-handled revolver. A scuffle ensues as the two fight for the weapon before Grace is wounded and Bennett flees to his home. He eventually decided to turn himself in. Bennett spent a few years in prison but was paroled early and came out as a more grown and wiser man. He eventually fell in love and married a woman named Emma, played by Mabel Allen, who was the daughter of a local gambler. During this time, Grace was still engaged to Lawton and eventually ditched him during a trip to Atlantic City, where she met Emma's gambler father, who promised to showcase her at his local gambling house. On this same trip, Grace took flight on a hydroplane and dropped a rose from the air, which just happened to land in the hat of her former lover, Bennett, who was with his wife along the beach. During her stage debut as La Valencia, where she was billed as the masked woman of mystery, the full crowd was filled with various public figures, including Emma and Bennett. The actual performance itself was based on Valeska performing her vaudeville act, Black Crepe and Diamonds. During the ovation of her act, Grace fainted when she saw Bennett's face. She proceeded to send him a note requesting his presence, but Bennett was shocked to find out her true identity as La Valencia and ripped off her mask in the crowded gambling hall. La Valencia threatened to expose Bennett's past to his wife Emma, but was overcome with madness and fell down a flight of stairs from 45 feet high, which resulted in her death. Despite Valeska's popularity in vaudeville enticing the public with the prospect of her debut, the studio used her well-known fashion reputation to further sell the film, with the press reporting that Valeska had worn over 150 gowns in the film, with each allegedly costing $25,000. I also design all my own clothes. In fact, I can sew to some advantage too, and I can trim my own hats. I keep 2 women busy with my clothes, but that belongs to my work, and aside from my work, I have very little time for anything else. My life is just work and then home. Valeska Suratt. Valeska followed up her film debut later that year with the release of Paramount Pictures' The Immigrant on December 20th. Written by Marion Fairfax and directed by George Melford, the film would act as her only film away from Fox. In this film, Valeska portrays a woman named Masha, a young Russian immigrant heading toward America to escape her life of poverty. After seeing Masha be insulted by an officer on the ship headed to the U.S., a young American contractor and civil engineer, David Harding, portrayed by Thomas Maine, helps to get Masha out of harm's way and secures a room on the second cabin for her. On the same ship, a wealthy politician and contractor, J.J. Walton, played by Theodore Roberts, finds himself captivated by Masha's beauty. As Masha arrives in New York, she is greeted by her sister Olga and her brother-in-law John, played by Jane Wolfe and Hal Clements. Walton eventually finds out Olga's address and secures permission from John for Masha to come over to his place and be employed as a maid. Despite fleeing back to her sister's on the first night after being attacked by Walton, he convinces her to return by promises of marriage and education. Sometime later, Walton grows infuriated after Harding successfully outbids him on a big government contract for a dam in Arizona, and plans to blow up the dam once it's near completion. In an effort to track its status as it's being built, Walton takes Masha on a trip to the area. Since meeting on the ship, Masha and Harding have met up several times, but he assumes that Masha has married his rival, Walton. When the night of the planned dam explosion comes, Walton threatens Masha into distracting Harding away from the area. After finding Harding, she informs him of Walton's plan. As he rushes back to the dam, Harding can do nothing but watch the dam explode, causing water to rush down into the village that's nearby. Despite gloating in his victory, Walton himself is killed as the rushing water floods the house he is in, causing it to collapse. Masha eventually finds David unconscious on top of a floating housetop. Once she gets to him, she wakes him up and informs him that she was never Walton's wife. Having had feelings for her all this time, Harding is delighted and asks Masha to marry him. According to an article in 1916 from Photoplay magazine, for her work on the film, Valeska was supposedly paid $5,000 a week by producer Jerry Lasky, making her one of the highest-paid silent film stars of that era. Valeska's third film would be released in September of 1916. In this film, The Straight Way, written and directed by Will S. Davis, Valeska would get her chance at adopting the role of a vamp, with the film allegedly acting as further fuel to her rivalry with Theda Bara. The film forever labeling Valeska as one of the 4 original vamps during the silent screen era, alongside Theda Bara, Virginia Pearson, and Louise Glom. In this film, Valeska plays a character named Mary Madison, who has an infant daughter named Marion with her husband John Madison, portrayed by Herbert Hayes. Early into the film, Mary is unjustly accused by her husband of having some type of dishonorable relationship with another man, and is promptly kicked from the family home. Heartbroken, she leaves her child in the care of her sister and leaves town via train. Later on, John hears of a railroad accident and believes that his wife must be dead. With this in mind, he takes his infant back home with him. Mary ends up surviving the accident, however. She has amnesia and cannot remember her husband or child. The story then jumps 20 years into the future, with Mary now having regained much of her memory and harboring a deep hatred for her husband who ruined her life. Yet there is a strong possibility that she is yet to remember her daughter. Despite this, her husband has since been elected governor of his state, and she plans to get revenge on him through his daughter Marion, portrayed by Elsie Balfour, who Mary falsely believes is from his second marriage. In her act of revenge, Mary plans to have ex-convict Dan Walters, portrayed by Glenn White, marries Marion. The two eventually meet and actually end up getting married, but Marion's gloating toward John would be cut short upon being told that Marion has been her daughter all along. Fortunately for Mary, in subsequent events in the film, it is found out that Dan is not really a convict, but rather was sent to prison in place of a friend of his. The movie ends on a happy note as Mary is reunited with her daughter. Valeska would finish off 1916 with 2 more titles, the first being a film called Jealousy, released on November 20th, written and directed by Will S. Davis. In this film, Valeska plays the character of Anne Baxter, a heartless young woman who marries Peter Martin, played by Walter Law, simply for his money despite not loving him. She goes on to try and make life difficult for both her husband and Roland Carney, played by Curtis Benton, the man she claims to truly love despite his inability to support her in the luxurious life she had grown accustomed to, as well as plaguing the life of Carney's wife out of pure jealousy. Justice is ultimately served when her husband Peter drags her down the stairs and kicks her out the front door. The story's basis revolves around a discontented woman who tries to find happiness by forcing men to love her, but she is crushed and helpless in the end. The film would go on to be praised for its many beautiful interior settings, such as the drawing room of Anna Baxter's home, which was described to be fitted with luxurious black and white oriental furnishings, allegedly costing thousands of dollars to erect. Valeska would finish off the year with the December 15th release of The Victim, written and directed by Will S. Davis. The film had Valeska portray a character named Ruth Merrill, a woman who has been unjustly jailed for her father's crimes. Soon after her release, Ruth meets a wealthy physician named Richard Bolden, played by Herbert Hayes, and the two get married. Eventually, her father and his gang discover that a bitter detective named Jack Higgins, played by John Charles, has been attempting to blackmail Ruth and is supposedly killed by her father in a brawl. Ruth is initially accused of the murder, having still been present after the ordeal, but her father confesses to the deed. She is essentially free to go and returns to her husband. The following year, she would star in her sixth film, The New York Peacock, released on February 5, 1917, written by Mary Murillo, and directed by Keenan Buell. The story is based on her character Zena and an odd relationship she forms with a man by the name of Billy Martin, played by Harry Hilliard. The story begins with Billy Martin being sent to New York to put through a war contract for his father, Mr. Martin, played by Eric Maine, a New England manufacturer, and takes $100,000 as security. Meanwhile, a gambling housekeeper named Graham, played by William Black, is made aware of Billy's arrival by a munition broker's secretary. Eventually, a man named Miller, played by John Macon, plans to lure Billy into the gambling house, acting as the broker's representative. During his promise of showing Billy the New York life, he meets Zena and is so captivated that he consents to try his luck at the roulette wheel. After his first success, he loses rapidly. At last, Zena drags him away with only $15,000 left. A remorseful Zena tries to comfort Billy, but is captivated by the courage in his determination to win back his losses. Reluctantly, she takes him to the gambling house where Billy loses the rest of his remaining money. When the mail brings no word from Billy, his wife, played by Claire Whitney, comes to New York. Upon her arrival, she enters his room just after he and Zena arrive, with Zena quickly hiding in a closet. Billy refuses to return with his wife until he has recovered his father's money. When Zena returns to her apartment, she is accused by Graham of double-crossing him before deciding to recover Billy's money herself as she returns to the gambling house. During this time, Billy's father, Mr. Martin, comes to New York for his son, but crosses paths with Zena, who plays to lure him to her den in order to get the money. Billy calls up, and when Zena recognizes his voice, she hangs up. Suspecting Zena has deceived him, Billy rushes to the apartment and finds her embracing his father. Zena rushes to him, but Billy casts her aside. Mr. Martin tells Billy that he did this to show the treachery of Zena's love. Heaping abuse on Zena, who sees her one true love lost, Billy leaves with his father. Zena, in remorse, leaves her old home and life a wreck. Billy asks for his father's forgiveness. "I forgive you," says the old man, "but I can't forget that I trusted you." The most striking feature of the film was said to be Valeska's costumes, decorated with spiders, tigers, swans, and gargoyles. Valeska's seventh film, titled She, again written and directed by Mary Murillo and Keenan Buell, would be released on April 23, 1917. As a loosely based adaptation of H. Rider Haggard's best-selling novel, She, A History of Adventure. The book's plot revolves around the journey of Horace Hawley and his ward Leo Vinci toward a lost kingdom in the African interior, with the two discovering a primitive race of natives and a white, all-powerful queen, Aisha, ruling as she, or she who must be obeyed. The rest of her films would also be released in 1917, including the June 3rd release of her 8th film, The Slave, written and directed by William Nye. The story follows Caroline, played by Valeska, who is a young and attractive woman working at a hairdressing parlor who is tired of her boring existence. One day she catches the eye of a wealthy man who takes her home in his automobile and proposes to her on the curb. Caroline then has a lucid dream where she marries the man, who then turns vicious and keeps her locked up in his mansion. As he finally dies, Caroline starts out having a good time with his money, but soon is ridden with guilt. She wakes up from the dream and turns down the offer of marriage, deciding instead to stay at the hair salon while waiting several years for her honest man to return from the West. This was followed up on July 1st with her 9th film, The Siren, written by Donald I. Buchanan and Walter Archer Frost and directed by Ronald West. The film would be praised for its absorbing and gripping screenplay, which was said to be clever enough to keep the audience in suspense until the very end. Valeska was given the role of Cherry Millard, an adventuress, which saw her continue to wear the breathtaking clothes that audiences had grown to expect, sustaining her reputation as the screen's most stunningly gowned woman. Her 10th film, Wife Number 2, written and directed by William Nye, would be released on July 29, 1917. In this film, Valeska's character Emma Rolfe is married off by her father to Dr. Bovar, played by Eric Maine, an old widower who has little interest in her and whose dedication to his medical practice results in wifely neglect. To stay amused, Emma finds herself in the company of several young men, the most notable being Rudolph Bulwer, played by John Goldworthy, a man she has known even before her marriage. The two eventually begin an affair, and despite his proclaimed love for her, Rudolph deserts Emma on the night of their arranged elopement. In her despair, she steals some acid from her husband and goes to the river to commit suicide with the intent of drinking the vial of acid. While standing by the water, Emma changes her mind and resolves to confess to Charles and beg his forgiveness. But the riverbank collapses under her feet and she drowns in the swift current. Although he has discovered Emma's love letters from Rudolph, Charles stoutly defends her honor in front of the townspeople and forgives her in his heart. On September 17, 1917, Valeska would star in her 11th and final film, A Rich Man's Plaything, written and directed by Carl Harbaugh. The final character she would play on the big screen would be Marie Grandin, a laborer at a New England oyster cannery who dreams of one day having enough money to take down the oppressive slumlords. She soon meets Lloyd, played by Edward Martindale, a rich tenement owner under the alias of Strange, and reveals her plans to him. After the plan piques his interest, he decides to test Marie by having a large sum of money transferred to her, the money acting as an inheritance of a distant relative. Marie eventually moves to New York to pursue her plan, with her main target coincidentally being Lloyd. But she soon finds herself aligned with his business rival Ogden Deneau, played by John T. Dillon, who holds little to no interest in her cause, seeing as his main goal is to simply ruin Lloyd. During this time, it is said that she had to settle an old score with Ogden and enlists Lloyd's help, who appears to still be acting under the alias of Strange. On the day of a great coup, Marie arranges to meet Ogden at a country inn where she exposes him to his wife. After returning to the city with Strange, he informs her that Ogden was bankrupt before revealing himself to be Lloyd. Despite being furious at first, she relents when Lloyd tells her that he had been testing her before starting a new life with him. Through no fault of her own, all of the films that Valeska possibly viewed as her most prized work are now impossible to be appropriately commended, seeing as all 11 of them are now considered lost. During the early morning hours of July 9, 1937, an ongoing heat wave in Little Ferry, New Jersey led to spontaneous ignition in the northwest corner of the Fox Vault, triggered by the nitrate decomposition of the film stock and the building's inability to handle the large buildup of dangerous gas. The damage spurred on by the subsequent fire would go on to be remembered as the infamous 1937 Fox Vault fire. The long-term effect this would have on film industry was not immediately understood at the time, seeing as Fox officials ensured that only old films happened to be destroyed. It would soon become apparent that the specific old films that had been lost were now in fact the highest quality versions of every Fox film that had been released before the year 1932, amounting to 75% of Fox's films at that time. According to Dave Kerr, curator at the Museum of Modern Art Film, there are entire careers that don't exist because of the fire. Men never liked the vampire type. They never fell for her. To catch a man, you must be less wise than he, in appearance at least. You must be subservient to him in your ways and must be deferential. Men like cuddlesome women, and the sort that look at them out of baby blue eyes and say, "Oh, you're so wonderful," or "so masterful." You know, that sort. It flatters them. They puff up and think how nice it would be to have that sweet little kitten around the fireside, and the first thing you know, they do have her. While the sturdy, strident, assertively vampire-ish thing is still wondering how he got away. Valeska Suratt. Chapter 6. Post-acting, 1920 to 1930. Valeska's brief film career always appeared to be plagued with a lack of creative control over the productions. Despite the collaborative effort of films, an atmosphere that was well suited for the performer she was, at the end of the day, the vision is always behind the eyes of the director. With films, Valeska most likely found it much difficult to fully prosper, having to relinquish power over the script, her costumes, or the manner in which she was to present herself on screen. As a new generation of cinema was ahead of Valeska, she allegedly suffered due to typecasting and an inability to adapt to new tastes among moviegoers, leading to her film career being cut prematurely. Valeska also found her film career practically doomed from the start due to her rival Theda Bara, a woman she could never avoid being compared to. While Valeska's vamp performances in She, The Slave, and Siren garnered praise, she was never going to dethrone the more favored Theda Bara, who was regarded as the most alluring and youthful-looking actress of the two. Allegedly, she and the studio came to a mutual agreement on Valeska returning to Vaudeville and Broadway, deciding it was little use to keep Valeska in the shadow of Theda Bara. After 1917, Valeska would never appear in any other films, essentially beginning the downward trajectory of her star power that suffered during the 1920s. After retiring from silent films, Valeska found an avenue that helped sustain her star power, returning to the stage with the 1917 playlet The Purple Lady, the first full-length play to ever appear in a New York vaudeville house. In it, she would portray a young lady with a questionable background who lures a former Russian governor to a Greenwich Village cafe and then strangles him with the scarf with which he had strangled her brother. With an emphasis on continuing her lifelong desire for dramatic acting, she managed to secure a playlet from Paul M. Potter in 1919 called The Purple Poppy. The playlet managed to secure the biggest hit of her vaudeville career. "I'm calling it The Purple Poppy, you see. I'm identified with the color purple." Valeska continued to produce some of her most successful stage performances with Scarlett at the Palace Theater in New York in 1920. Intrigued with Jack Late's play One of Us, she would have it condensed and adapted into 40 minutes to accommodate Valeska's vaudeville act. The one-act play was ultimately renamed Scarlett in order to better fit her image. Miss Suratt plays the role of a cabaret singer who strives and deserves to reach a higher plane in life. All the while, she is loved by a society type, played by Eugene Strong, who pretends to be a tough guy in order to win the singer's affection. Miss Suratt gives a subtle impersonation of a woman of the slums who feels the urge of finer things. The New York Dramatic Mirror, November 6, 1920. Valeska continued to hold on to her prominent vaudeville status, hitting her peak in 1920 with The Dynamic Force of Vaudeville, which would have Valeska headline the Palace Theater in New York. This was followed by her final Broadway appearance 2 years later in a 1922 revue titled Spice, shattering Al Jolson's crowd record at the Winter Garden in New York. As the Roaring Twenties approached its end, Valeska, who had long been overtaken by the new generation of women and fashion, gave her last performance in the Frolics of 1929. Chapter 7. The Kings of Kings Plagiarism Case. While Valeska had long fallen out of favor well into the late 1920s, with the actress past her glory days and now in her late 40s, all doors for a potential comeback were all permanently locked after the release of 1927's The King of Kings. This all began around 1917 as Valeska became an avid follower of the Baha'i faith. She soon persuaded the movement's secretary and author Mirza Ahmad Sorab to help her co-write a script based on the life of Mary Magdalene. It would soon turn out that the script, whose purpose was intended to take her film career to new heights, could also be cited as the beginning of her obsession with the Bible and the Virgin Mary. Once the script was completed, Valeska wasted no time in sending it off to Will Hay and Cecil B. DeMille for a review. After a few months, Valeska would see the script returned to her, essentially rejected with no comments added whatsoever. The script remained forgotten until 1927, when DeMille's The King of Kings hit theaters, leading Valeska to accuse him of stealing her script and allegedly sue him for $1 million. During this time, Valeska became acquainted with Julia Lynch Olin, a fellow Baha'i and co-founder of the New History Society in New York. Olin would accompany Valeska on a trip to New York, with the two deciding to attend a stage version of The King of Kings on Broadway, all before the actual lawsuit went to trial. It was at this show where it became apparent to Olin that The King of Kings was inspired by the actual Gospels within the Bible. Despite this revelation, Olin was not able to convince Valeska, as she refused to see the story as nothing but a ripoff of her script. The outcome of the case would practically remain unknown, with the trial taking place in February of 1930 to little publicity, as it would be settled out of court. Consequently, Valeska found herself unofficially blacklisted, and with no chance of salvaging her career, Valeska disappeared. Chapter 8. Later Life and Death, 1930 to 1962. With her fame long behind her and the damage following the plagiarism lawsuit, Valeska was no longer able to live the glamorous life she was blessed with in her prime. Seeing as in the 1930s she was found stricken with poverty and living in a cheap New York hotel. The poor state of Valeska's whereabouts during this time reached novelist Fannie Hurst, most famous for her book Imitation of Life. After discovering Valeska's fall from grace, Hurst took it upon herself to gracefully organize a benefit for her, raising $2,000. Hurst's kind deed appeared to be in vain, as Valeska simply disappeared for weeks after receiving the money. Upon her return, she was found carrying 6 eggs and a bouquet of roses, apparently losing all the money gambling, finding herself back in the same state that she had fallen into even before the benefit. Surprisingly, later on in her life, she actually would make one final attempt at somewhat reviving her career, although this time she would set her sights on selling her life story to one of William Randolph Hearst's newspapers, as an autobiography filled with self-penned memoirs. Valeska's attempt would not be ignored, with a reporter sent to read her manuscript, although its reception appeared to be mainly negative due to the ludicrous claims that filled its pages, such as Valeska proclaiming herself to be the Virgin Mary and the Mother of Jesus. One reporter would swear she was completely batty. It is well known that Valeska was very passionate about religion and the Bible, often expressing her beliefs in writing, but this did not stop many from claiming that she most likely had begun to suffer from some sort of mental illness. Whether this supposed illness was due in part to the drastic collapse of her life and career will never be known. It's after this failed attempt when her life became a blur. It is unknown how she lived out the latter of her life, whether she struggled or lived in peace. In spite of everything, she went on to live a long life, spending her last years in a nursing home in Washington, D.C., where she would pass away at the age of 80 on July 2, 1962. Valeska would be buried next to her mother at Highland Lawn Cemetery in her beloved hometown of Terre Haute, Indiana. Valeska Suratt's resting place eventually saw a well-deserved renovation nearly 60 years after her death, by the virtue of a GoFundMe fundraiser organized by a Terre Haute arts enthusiast, Dot Lewis, and her husband, Dennis W. Hammond. In 2022, Valeska Suratt was at last given a proper tombstone of her own. In her interview with the Tribune-Star, Lewis exclaimed, "We as a community should step up and pay tribute to those who came before us and honor their memory and legacy. Valeska's life needs to be celebrated and her grave recognized with a marker that future generations can visit and view." It's now been over 60 years since the world bid farewell to its long-forgotten star. While her legacy in today's age may unfortunately live on as one of the most noteworthy cases of the 1937 Fox Vault fire, her impact on the entertainment business at the turn of the 20th century can be credited as an example of an early push toward the gradual transition of unshackling women. She was someone who engraved her name as an inspiration for many women due to all of the triumphs in her career, finding success in loosening societal expectations on how far and expressive women could truly be. She was an early advocate of parading a sexual edge, exemplifying a performer who was not afraid of inviting criticism toward her work that revolved around the authenticity of not only her personality and dedicated talents, but of her eagerness to unconcernedly choose who she wanted to be remembered as. "It's my personality that wins for me. I'm no singer. Heaps of people can beat me dancing. Precious few of them, though, get the salary I do. Why? Because I'm me." Valeska Suratt. This has been Valeska Suratt, the Forgotten Heroine of the 20th Century, written by Efren Mendieta, narrated by Skye.